Players gather to cast powerful spells, some of the oldest and most revered in the history of Magic the Gathering. Brainstorm, Daze, Force of Will, and many others. Battling head-to-head in brutal combat, they all have one thing in common: to uphold their legacy and the search for eternal glory.
The Eternal Glory podcast is brought to you by the minds behind BoshNRoll on YouTube, ThrabenU University, and theepicstorm.com. This episode is sponsored by 3-for-1 Trading and Sparks Law Practice.
Hello, and welcome to episode 130 of the Eternal Glory podcast, Warped by the Frog. We've already recorded 30 minutes of introduction and banter for the week, available in our supporter-exclusive pre-show. Check out patreon.com/eternalglory to gain access, or join as a YouTube member for the same content on YouTube instead. And honestly, it was a lot more than 30 minutes this week. We got deep into some stuff. As always, I'm Phil Gallagher, aka ThrabenU.
I am Brian Coval, aka BoshNRoll.
And I am Bryant Cook of the Epic Storm.
If you want to join our Patreon, patreon.com/eternalglory, and you can join new members. Let me get my list up here. We've got Deucemoosvum, internet name, I hope, Suna, Bobo, Greg C, James O, Sean P, Scarab, 5Q, Bad Splur, The Nomad, and Gaming with Thunder.
Thank you to all of our supporters.
Speaking of supporters, this episode is brought to you by Sparks Law, a business transactional law firm owned by Eternal Magic community member Jonathan Sparks. If you're an entrepreneur, business owner, or gig worker looking to start your own company, Sparks Law can help with partnership agreements, contract reviews, intellectual property protection, or any other business legal questions. If you want to shape your business strategy with a fellow Eternal gamer, reach out via email to jsparks, that's JSPARKS, at sparkslawpractice.com, or call 470-268-5234. 3-for-1 Trading is one of Europe's leading Magic the Gathering traders. Their online shop has a fantastic selection of high-end Magic cards, especially for vintage, legacy, and old-school players. You can find them at shop.3for1trading.com or visit their booth at major events. They run weekly sales, and new, individually scanned high-end cards are added every Wednesday. Code Eternal Glory will get you our community-exclusive offer of free worldwide shipping on your first order of $500, and you can experience firsthand their world-class customer service and exact grading for yourself.
And if you'd like to advertise to over 10,000 plus Eternal gamers every single episode, reach out to us. We're always accepting new sponsors. Gentlemen, how about that Eternal Weekend announcement, huh? Are you going to be attending Eternal Weekend? Can we group hug, click our heels in the air, all that good stuff?
Play for a painting? Oh, wait!
Wow!
Okay, so what the gentlemen are goofing about right now, Eternal Weekend was announced for this year, October 12th and 13th in Shizuoka, Japan, November 21st through 24th in Pittsburgh, PA, December 6th through 8th in Prague, Czech Republic. Those are the dates. They are spread out for anyone who's trying to get to all of them. There's close to a month between each one. I guess November to December is actually a pretty quick turnaround. But a big announcement that affected all of us and started a bunch of sappy posts on social media from previous winners, myself included, is there's no paintings. The original art for being the vintage or legacy champion no longer is a thing, or at least is not a thing this year. That tradition predates Eternal Weekend, way back to when it was the format championships at Gen Con, before the branding changed, and has gone strong all this time. To replace the paintings, they're doing exclusive promo cards, which they were doing the last 2 years for Top 8. They're expanding them to Top 32, get a non-foil, and Top 8 get a foil. It is crop rotation for Legacy and Tinker for Vintage this year. How do we feel about this, gentlemen?
I love Tinker. I love Tinker. I love Tinker. I love Tinker. I don't know if I would actually use it, but that would be one that I think I would get like graded or something and just like keep it as a prized possession on my desk. I really hope I do well in that one.
I'm currently at a place with Magic where I'm not excited to go and play tournaments, and the painting being taken away from the prize pool is like another blow that takes the wind out of my sails. So I don't know. Maybe I will be excited about Magic by the time November rolls around, but I haven't booked a plane ticket yet, and I have plane tickets booked to Magic on Vegas is all I'm saying.
I have a controversial opinion on this. Brian, you might want to close your ears. I love the painting idea, but I also love the idea that top 32 gets a little bit more, because even though I top 8'd last year, the money outside of the painting has never been very good. So I did get that promo card last year. I will say that I definitely sold it for more than $4,000. It was a little under $5,000 is what I ended up getting for it. It was a Dragon's Rage channeler that I did not give a flying F about. And that was nice, but if they didn't come with that promo, the prize was $1,000 for being in less than the top 1% of players. And it's like an $80 entry or something like that. And it felt like a lot of entry for the prize pool to be a little bit shallow. That said, Eternal Weekend has that mystique about it. There is the painting that is attached to it, which I think does drive in a lot of traffic. So this year I'm interested to see what the room looks like without the painting. That said, 9 through 32 getting more than $100 or whatever for being in the top, 2 to 3%, I think is also great. I don't see why we potentially couldn't have it all. Like, have the painting, have the promos to top 32. I mean, it's free for Wizards to print promos that cost them next to nothing. And I think commissioning the art is probably the expensive thing for them, and that's why they're getting away with it. If you think of like a logistics standpoint, you have to go talk to Alana Donner or Vulcan Baga and commission a Mox or a Time Walk or whatever the art ends up being. And you're now paying some artist $15,000 to $20,000 or whatever the price may be for each event. And I think that sometimes people forget about that, and that's money that is coming out of Wizards' pocket and not the tournament organizer.
Yeah, that's the expense at the Wizards level. And I don't know what an artist gets paid to paint, Time Walk or whatever. Like, I have one of these paintings on my back wall. I know what offers I have received on it, and none of them have moved the needle for me yet. But I don't know what it costs to make this. And that is the big thing. They have to commission art for promos too. Like, it might be digital art, which I don't know if that's cheaper or ends up the same. They don't have to ship a painting around, but they did have to get new arts for Tinker and Crop Rotation this year. And they had to get new arts for Ponder and Dragon's Rage Channeler and Gush and Mental Misstep over the last 2 years as well. And maybe that's what tipped the needle, because commissioning one art per event versus 2 arts per season, then also 1 art per event, might have been over whatever budget they have for this. I don't know. Regardless of that, the flatter prize structure is cool. Wizards has been leaning really hard into promos as prizes now. They have figured out what every other game in history has figured out, which is they can print these things for the cost of commissioning art on them, basically. And then they can make 4 of them, as is the case of the Secret Lair Brainstorms and Dark Rituals. Or they could make 32 of them, or 64, or whatever. And they will be cool and desirable at a low cost. And the thing about the paintings, though, is that could be life-changing money. I know offers up to 6 figures have been offered on previous Eternal Weekend paintings, depending on the desirability and the artist and the card and the art market at the time and stuff. But it's every single one of them is sold for more than 5 figures that's sold, and some have been offered 6. And I don't think a top 8 foil Tinker is going to sell for 10K, certainly not 100. So we are talking about a different thing here, even if the overall cost to Wizards to commission the art or whatever. I don't know. Again, we're not privy to those conversations. I don't have the bill for the artists and painting 6 Black Lotuses last year, or 3 Black Lotuses at 3 whatever lightning bolts. It is worse, though, for the mystique and the chase. Like, I was, at the end of last season, basically locked to go to all 3 this year. Like, whenever they're announced, if the scheduling can work, like if they're not on the same weekend, basically, I was planning to go to Japan, Europe, and America. And I know a bunch of other people, like Justin Gennari and a European contingent, like Hans H.J. Goddick. They do go to all 3 whenever they can. And a lot of those people are like, without paintings, I'm not sure if I'm going to chase it that hard this year. And, I am kind of in the same boat because it's not cheap to get to Japan. I'll probably still be in Prague no matter what. But going to Japan cost me like 3 or 4 times what it cost me to get to Prague. And it's basically up to my sponsors to come through at this point because I am not excited to put my own money into this endeavor at this point.
The friend that gave me a ride back from Baltimore to Syracuse, they messaged me when Eternal Weekend was announced, and they were just like, Bryant, just so you know, out of Newark, flight to Japan, $800 round trip, flight to Prague, $600 round trip. We doing this? And I was just like, I have a family, man. Probably not, but I'll go to Pittsburgh. Brian, do you think that at least you'll make the long trip to Pittsburgh?
I will certainly make the long trip to Pittsburgh. And as far as organizers of the Eternal Weekends, Card Titan is the one that has responded to my conversations about, can I help you hype this event? Like, do you want to do something together with the BoshNRoll channel? Because, like, as far as I know, I am the biggest legacy platform, and then Phil is right behind me. And we have Eternal Glory, which we're one of 2 or 3 top Eternal podcasts. So, I mean, we are the people if they need to hype, but also Card Titan, which is another part of this conversation of pulling prize support or changing prize support from Eternal Weekend at the Wizards level. Card Titan's Eternal Weekend blew the doors off the entire universe last year. They had to raise the cap, 6 or 7 times, even up to the night before the event. People were like, wait, it capped? I'm in Pittsburgh. What do you mean? Or someone who, I know one of our mutual friends who I'm not going to call out for missing the boat, bought the super VIP Eternal Weekend package, but forgot to register for the actual event. He thought it was included in the several $100 package he bought. Nope, wasn't. And he was just in Pittsburgh in the VIP room, hey, can I get in the event? And Prague was pretty big. I don't know what happened in Japan. I heard that one was smaller, but also the European TO, the prizes were not good. Outside of the painting, it was literally prize wall tickets. Card Titan gives cash. At least we got that going for us. And this is our big thing every year as legacy players, as vintage players, getting one of those paintings on your wall, talking about some of the goats in our space, having 2 paintings, measuring success in paintings. That language is just going to die here if this is the course for the future. I'm still hyped, though. Don't get me wrong. I know I just said a lot of negative things. I'm still going to go to 2 of them and try to get to 3.
So one thing that I will be changing, and I plan on going to Pittsburgh. By the way, they announced it not on my kid's birthday. I don't have to be a terrible parent this year. Pretty excited about that. But I regretted last year not doing the VIP package after seeing the playmats. So assuming that I'm going, and I'm pretty sure I am, I'll be doing the VIP this year for the first time. Not because I want all of the extra swag, but seeing the playmats last year, the stitched playmats with the incredible art on them, I want that. I need it.
I have sprung for the VIP package, and I think I still have all the playmats, but each of those playmats that they give every year would have sold for the price of the VIP package. The Library of Alexandria one I play on, usually that was one of them. Actually, Eternal Weekend, Card Titan's Eternal Weekend in general, their playmats, even for the main events, tend to sell more than entry. So that's always been an insane value proposition to prop up that event. Should we talk about something else, though?
Yeah, maybe that card that nobody's happy with, and believe it or not, it's not Grief.
Right. So, Phil, how about you set us up here?
All right. So we are looking forward to Monday, August 26th, which is the next scheduled BNR update. At this point, we don't have it in this many words, but we've basically been told, yeah, Grief's going to go. It should have gone last time. We don't officially have that, but it's kind of what we're feeling. But we're talking about bans again in this episode because we as a podcast don't believe that Grief alone leaving the format right now actually fixes the format, because Psychic Frog has officially reached problematic levels in Legacy. It was a card that went slightly under our radar at the beginning of MH3 release season, to immediately recognizing it as an incredibly good card once we saw it in play. And now this week's conversation is this card needs to be banned.
Yeah, and it's not just us. This has, even 2 weeks ago, last time we recorded, I was like, There's pros and cons over Dreadhorde Arcanist. I think drawing a card at random if it connects is generally worse than casting Ponder or Lightning Bolt just on the attack. And I still believe that to be true. I do think Psychic Frog is worse than Dreadhorde Arcanist. It also costs 2 colors. It's harder to cast. One of those colors is blue. You can Pyroblast this thing. I think this is a worse card than Dreadhorde Arcanist in our format. However, it might still be over the line. And there's a couple nuances to this conversation. I'll let Phil do all the numbers that he collected for this episode, but Psychic Frog being a blue-black card when the best deck that needed something banned out of it was already a blue-black deck that benefits specifically from the various things Psychic Frog does, obviously pushing the play rate up a little bit. Another thing is Grief is a different kind of problem than Psychic Frog is. Grief punches the hole in a way that you cannot interact with to do something deeply messed up and unbeatable you can't catch up to for 0 mana, which is a different thing than answering a 2-mana creature. And I say answering a 2-mana creature as if it's preposterous when we're already making the comp to Dreadhorde Arcanist, which proved that answering a 2-mana creature was already too hard for the power level that card was on. So I do think that Grief is more messed up than Psychic Frog as a thing, or at least as a package. And we'll talk about, as we work through our notes here, what else could go from that package if Wizards determines Grief is somehow more interesting than the other things propping it up, which I think is a bunch of horse hockey, personally. But Grief is one problem, and then right behind it is Psychic Frog, which is a different problem, and I think a lower problem, but still, Legacy might not be healthy after Grief is gone.
I have a quick note here. So, Brian, I'm not trying to make it seem like you're being an apologist for Psychic Frog, but I do think you're making it look slightly softer than it actually is. So you mentioned that it's a 2-mana creature, dies to removal. Well, it dies to specific removal because you could just discard 2 cards and all of a sudden it lives through a Lightning Bolt, the premier removal spell of Legacy. So now I've even seen Grixis Delver switching off from Lightning Bolt to play Fatal Push. And now they're losing tempo, which makes them worse in other matchups, and it has cascading effects throughout the format. It being a blue and black creature, obviously there's Grief plus Force of Will, so it's never truly dead. And card advantage, it gives itself evasion. Unlike Dreadhorde Arcanist, it closes the window very quickly while creating card advantage. And I just think that Psychic Frog, in the last episode, I was like, well, it's not exactly Dreadhorde, and I still believe that. I think it could even possibly be a little bit better in the shell that it's currently in. And I think if Wizards was to only ban Grief, they're just leaving the door open for Grixis Delver to be over the line in the next format at this point. So Wizards, if you're listening, please listen to this entire episode and why Psychic Frog needs to go.
Right. And I agree with all your points. I don't think Psychic Frog is soft. I think that it is less powerful than Dreadhorde Arcanist. I know it is less powerful than Grief in terms of rules of engagement, but I also know, as stated, we have been demonstrated in the past to be unable to warp healthily and successfully around a 2-drop creature that dies to removal. So we have a very clear historical precedence here. This is kind of like Pauper banning Cranial Ram when Cranial Plating's already on the ban list. Like, we have Dreadhorde Arcanist on the ban list, and now we've got Psychic Frog in our format. Like, I could see the comps, and they're different, but not that different. And yeah, Phil, why don't you give us some numbers and we can continue this conversation?
Sure. I think while we're kind of in this Dreadhorde territory, though, I'm just going to say something aloud that many of our viewers are already kind of thinking. Every single time that a Delver-style deck gains access to a pushed source of card advantage at 2 mana, the format does tend to break. Dreadhorde, EI, Dig Through Time, Renin 6, take your pick. Psychic Frog is the next one of these things in line that is probably just a little bit too strong and does a few too many things.
Well, why is that, Phil? Can we at least do a quick explanation of why these things continually break?
So a tempo deck at its fundamental level is supposed to give up late game in exchange for early game. Daze is a bad card because it sets you back on a land drop. Force of Will is a bad card because it requires you to pitch a second card from your hand. And a tempo deck is supposed to sacrifice an end game to have a strong early game. When you have a 2-mana source of card advantage that just lets you recoup all your losses from Daze, Force of Will, Griefs, other spells of that general nature, then all of a sudden your tempo deck also becomes a control deck, and oftentimes the best tempo deck and the best control deck end up being the same thing.
Yeah, we did a whole episode on this if you want to check our logs. Sorry, I don't know the one right now, but we went pretty deep on this and talking about free spells. And generally, the player who spends the most mana wins a game of Magic. And the way that cards like Daze and Force of Will work is Daze, you lose a land, which inhibits your ability to spend mana later. And you get a 1-mana effect, Force Spike, out of setting yourself back a land. So you burst 1 mana's worth of effect on the game at the cost of being able to spend mana later. But if the game's over, it no longer matters. So Delver of Secrets, Daze your spell. I've spent 2 mana on those 2 plays, or I've generated 2 mana's worth of effects on the game while spending 1 mana on that setup. And Force of Will is a 2-mana effect counter spell, and it costs 2 spells and a life. But if I'm ahead, life total doesn't matter. If the game's over, my cards in hand don't matter. But Force of Willing something is kind of like making 2 mana's worth of effect on the game. And if we count out at the end, like Delver, Psychic Frog, Daze you, Force you, I have spent 6 mana worth of things on, and I've actually tapped lands for mana 3 times. And I'm way ahead in that early game. So being able to continue spending mana because you continue to have cards because something keeps drawing you more cards on a hyper efficient level breaks the whole mold of why this works normally.
All right, so let's talk some results. The Gen Con Secret Lair tournament just happened, and if you haven't heard of this, it was a big deal because you were playing for a 1 of 4 copy of Dark Ritual. I think this thing sold for, I think it was $40,000 or somewhere thereabout. $48,000. So that is bigger than damn near everything that happens in Legacy. That is a serious tournament.
The Pro Tour, first place for the Pro Tour for the entire run of the 2010s was $40,000. I think it was like bumped to 45 at one point. And since like the COVID era and the Mythic Championships and stuff, the numbers have been all over the place. But the number firmly planted in my head from all my years consuming Pro Tour coverage is you get $40K for winning the Pro Tour. And this thing sold for 48 on site. It's not even theoretical. It was just like a person already has the first 2. This is the third one. The last one will be won by someone in Vegas, and somebody is building the set and they have the means to do it. The number was known and it was gone.
So Griefless Dimir Psychic Frog won that event. Grief and Bowmaster's metagame shares are both going down as Psychic Frog is replacing it in the same and similar decks, and Psychic Frog is now the most popular creature in Legacy. Psychic Frog, that has been out for a month and a half, was it June? 2.5 months?
Thereabouts.
Regardless, it is now the most played card in Legacy in all of Legacy's card pool, which is everything. 69% of the top 32
nice
deck lists, yes, obligatory, at the Gen Con Secret Lair events were Psychic Frog, including 17 Riskaminator deck lists.
Right. So just let me put some context on this event. The way that this thing works is there are single elimination grinders that after 5 rounds, somebody is undefeated. That person wins a Secret Lair promo Murktide region that's worth about $2,000. There are 32 of those in the world, or there's 24 right now. There will be 32 after Vegas at the end of the year. And then everyone who wins the Murktide region gets entered into the top 8, where they play another single elimination for that $48,000 Dark Ritual. Somebody has to go 8-0 to win this tournament. And this tournament was at Gen Con, which means it was behind a significant paywall to even enter the tournament, which means that the people in that tournament were either Gen Con attendees who didn't know what was about to happen to them, or the most dedicated sickos imaginable. And I know that people who made the top 8 of this tournament included previous Magic World Champion Nathan Stoyer and 2-time Eternal Weekend champion Jujubeen. The winner, Burnt Taco, is really making a name for themselves, brewing a bunch of cool decks and crushing a bunch of stuff lately. These are serious legacy players. I know a couple of people, some of my friends were messaging me, really dialing in their Rescaminator sideboard plans and stuff. And every single one of these people was playing Rescaminator, except for Burnt Taco, who played this Dimir, or this griefless version, hyper-tuned for Rescaminator.
So as far as other recent results go, I really enjoyed Anurag Das's tweet about the July 31st challenge. It was something like 28 of 32 possible psychic frogs. And many other recent tournaments have looked that same way, where it is becoming clear that Psychic Frog is now the thing that Legacy is circulating around rather than just Grief.
Yep.
And all of these like Blue, Black, and Grixis tempo deck lists without Grief are like very much overperforming. So if only Grief leaves the format, there is already kind of a de facto top dog in these Blue, Black, or Grixis Dimir Frog tempo deck lists.
Right.
Gentlemen, I would like to give a quick reminder. Probably about 3 or 4 months ago, we did an episode about how Orcish Bowmasters wasn't over the line for Legacy. And looking at recent deck lists, because I recorded a couple Legacy videos this week, some of the Rescaminator deck lists have 0 Orcish Bowmasters in the 75. And if they play any at all, it's like 2 in the sideboard. And I think we've come a long way in that 4 months from ban Orcish Bowmasters with us being not so sure to Grief has to go to Grief and Psychic Frog need to go. It's been a journey, and I think that even if these 2 cards do get banned out of the format, we're going to have some number of people that are still unhappy with Orcish Bowmasters, but at some point, there needs to be something that stays, right?
Remember also ban Up the Beanstalk. Remember ban the One Ring. And there's a lot of people who don't contact Legacy that often, or they're new to Legacy, or they only play a few times a year and use the podcast to keep up with stuff. And during all those calls to ban Up the Beanstalk, ban Orcish Bowmaster, ban the One Ring, and we were all just kind of, the 3 of us were like, I don't know, it seems fine for the format. It's different, but it's attackable. We are now in a truly broken metagame, one that we have seen before, those of us who have been playing Legacy a long time, and seeing cards like Grief and Psychic Frog compared to cards like Up the Beanstalk and Orcish Bowmaster really crystallized for me the difference between a new card that is clearly Legacy playable and might shift some rules of engagement, but is appropriate. I would put Nadu in that category as well. But then there are cards that, what the hell am I supposed to do about this? Which is like Grief and Psychic Frog right now.
So to just put some words on it, leaving Psychic Frog legal in Legacy is a mistake. Period. Okay.
So that is true. I want to talk just an anecdote from earlier today. I recorded with this Burnt Taco Griefless Dimir deck, and I had a phenomenal match versus basic land heavy, back to basics Jeskai Stoneblade. And we had just this really cool 3-game set where my opponent did some stuff like Swords to Plowshares your Nethergoyf, Resolve to Fairy Time Raveler, Bounce your Psychic Frog, back to basics you. And we had this really cool, like, 1-for-1 here. Somebody has to force a will. Now we're down a card. And then they Snapcaster Mage, which gets the card back that they lost on Force of Will earlier. And just this really nice jockey back and forth. And you do get games like that. They are possible with Psychic Frog. But it really felt to me when I was on the Dimir side not having Grief, Entomb, Reanimate in my build when my opponent was trying to play stuff like Swords to Plowshares and Stoneforge Mystic, it was not embarrassing for them, which is the experience when you have Grief, Entomb, and Reanimate. And I talked to when we started this section about the tiers of like Grief being 0 mana interaction that is also a Reanimate enabler, and all the things that Grief is that we've been talking about for the last 11 months are so much higher and so much more messed up and completely changed all of the rules of interaction, where Psychic Frog is basically the rule of interaction is this is going to be harder to kill every turn it's in play. And you want interaction that will kill a creature of any size. So white or Pyroblast or black interaction that just kills it dead, versus there's nothing I could do because Grief costs 0 and the game is over before I play a land. I just want to like really talk about my experience today, the difference between having Grief, Reanimate, and Entomb in my deck and not in this same shell. It was palpable in that sort of environment.
Gentlemen, in the comments section of our last episode, we had a number of people say, I think Reanimate is the true problem. And we talked about that in the last episode. And I believe all three of us agree. Reanimate is a card that is extremely powerful. It is a card that also defines Legacy to some extent. And if Wizards has decided that Legacy is the format where Daze is acceptable, is this card that continually pushes the Tempo Shell over, which is why Renin 6, Oko, Dreadhorde Arcanist, and all these other cards needed to leave, Psychic Frog fits that bill and then also needs to leave eventually because it slots in that same exact spot. And Reanimate doesn't do the same thing. If you remove Grief, Psychic Frog, Reanimate goes back to being the red-black faithless looting pseudo combo deck instead of this tempo hybrid combo deck that gets to do all of the things. And I think that's sort of the divide right now, where this Reanimator deck isn't really a combo deck anymore. It's a tempo deck that gets to abuse the Delver shell, and that's what pushed it over the line.
Yeah, and this is just a really important conversation, which we've had 1,000 times in every possible place it can be had. But in order to be complete on this conversation we're having today, the Delver Shell, if we are just listing card after card for the first 30 minutes of this episode that got banned because Daze Wasteland Force of Will pushed them over the line, why aren't we banning Daze Wasteland Force of Will? Why are we dancing around that? And do you guys want to go first? Because I have big thoughts on this.
If you're gearing up for a rant, who the fuck am I to stop a rant? The floor is yours, sir.
It's not so much a rant, and you could find these thoughts in my videos and the years of this podcast we've done and like anywhere. But the issue is that a healthy, balanced Delver, I'm just going to call it Delver, whether it plays Delver of Secrets or not, Delver deck is a good thing to balance a metagame around. Those are fundamentally fair decks that attack and block and exchange resources to win the game and pull ahead here and there or fall behind here and there based on tight decisions made by both players. When we talk about Magic as Garfield intended, Delver is really freaking close to Magic as Garfield intended. Another thing that is really good about Delver is it's exploitable in a variety of ways. Like I just talked about with that Jeskai Stoneblade deck with 5 or 7 basic lands, a bunch of white removal. I'm never wasting them. I'm never dazing a spell. They might play more removal than I have threats in my deck. It's possible that that balances off. I personally have decked Delver players many times in my career just by having more white cards in my deck than they have creatures to put into play. Those are play patterns you can exploit. And on top of all of those other things, Delver is hard. It is a hard deck. There is an experience of somebody picking up Delver, knowing nothing about Legacy. And then there's the experience of somebody who knows quite a bit about Legacy. And then there's the experience of a Delver expert, like a Jujubee or a Rich Cali, like somebody like that. And those are completely different things. You are playing against a different deck, depending on the hands of the experience of the pilot. The ability to stack a Ponder and think 3 turns ahead knowing when to pick up all your lands to triple daze something to protect a threat versus letting that threat go and try to get value elsewhere. Like, all of these things are so tight and so hard. And if the best deck in the format is a fair deck that has exploitable axes it plays on, that's also freaking hard to do correctly, I think that's a perfect sauce for something to build your format around.
Also, when the Delver deck is fair and balanced, you tend to have a circulating metagame where people adjust for the current Delver variant. The Delver variant maybe picks up some new tech, going a little higher or a little lower in curve, maybe changing colors. The control decks kind of shift to adapt to that. The combo decks change. And I feel like a lot of times Delver being good but not broken leads to a metagame doing its normal thing.
Yeah, when Delver has like a Life from the Loam in the sideboard for the mirror, that rules. When we have to main deck 2 Pyroblast because Psychic Frog is the only thing that matters, that sucks. Like, there is a balance of, I think Delver is a beautiful masterpiece of, I don't want to call it design because it wasn't really designed, but I mean, the cards that exist, distilling the pool down to the core shell and then pivoting splash colors week by week. Like, Delver is always blue. It's usually red. And then it's, but I have seen blue-white when white removal's good, or you need to go a little bigger with Stoneforge Mystic. Adding the third color. Are we just Izzet? Are we Rug? Are we Grixis? Are we Bug? If we want something like Abrupt Decay. Like, I think that is a beautiful dance that happens at the core of a healthy legacy format. When we agree on 71 of the 75 and the list is just lock stock and it's built around a card like Psychic Frog or like Dreadhorde Arcadist or like Ren and 6 or like Deathrite Shaman, that is an issue. So keeping Delver healthy keeps Legacy healthy is, I guess, my thesis of this whole proposal.
I want to circle back to Entomb and Reanimate just for one closing thought here before we move on. I have seen a decent number of people talk about an Entomb ban or a Reanimate ban, fearing that some sort of tempo Reanimator hybrid deck still exists if Entomb and Reanimate are legal. And I don't think Entomb and Reanimate are problematic cards within the shell of Legacy, because when we look at the past, 15 years of Legacy, Reanimator has not been a good strategy unless your name was Eric Landon, in which case you were eating good. There have been very few periods where it felt like Reanimator was just one of the best decks in the format. And I think if we lose out on grief giving very easy and recurable protection, and we lose out on Psychic Frog as an additional tempo angle, I think whatever is left there is fine.
Yeah, I agree. Entomb was banned in Legacy. I think they unbanned it in 2010. And there was a brief period where Reanimator was the best deck, Blue-Black Reanimator, but that deck had Entomb and Mystical Tutor in it. And then Mystical Tutor got banned, and Reanimator settled into a really comfortable spot for the last 13 years or so. And comfortable to the point of even bad, like Phil just said. The deck, it had kind of its Oops All Spells arc with the White Chancellor and Dark Rituals and just trying to Grizzlebrand plus second monster every turn one. And if you had a Surgical Extraction or you just went first and played Grafdigger's Cage, it was over. That deck sucks, but it is cool that it exists. I feel the same way about Oops All Spells. I feel the same way about a lot of decks. High Tide. Like, there's a bunch of decks that I think are cool, and I think people should be able to play them if they like those play patterns. And I think an Entomb ban kills a whole subset of dope shit that can and should exist in Legacy. That said, I've been saying for a month, we've been saying on this podcast the last couple episodes, it's Wizards of the Coast job to curate a format, not ours. And if they decide this whole thing is broken, get rid of Grief and Entomb, then that's what we're going to play with. But I really think that Entomb and Reanimate are unique and awesome. They're actually so unique and awesome that previous Modern Horizon sets put Persist and Shallow Grave Was it Shallow Grave? Is that what the one's called? I don't know. They put a 2-mana Entomb and a 2-mana conditional Entomb and a 2-mana conditional Reanimate into Modern because these play patterns are so cool. And what is the difference between Legacy and Modern if not 1 mana on all your dope spells? Like, I think this is an identity core of non-rotating Eternal formats that we are better, that it's around. And that is coming from probably one of the most salty people imaginable when I get turn 1 Grizzle branded.
All right, let's talk about some tentacle monsters for a second. Eldrazi has been on the rise recently, really picking up strong metagame shares, more and more of it every week. And from more casual players than not, I often hear like, this Eldrazi deck is too good. We have to do something to stop this. And I don't think Eldrazi is powerful enough to have anything banned ever, maybe? Not in Legacy anyway. So as far as this current moment goes, the Eldrazi deck isn't even done being made, folks. People do not know what this deck is supposed to look like. There is not a consensus build. There's not a consensus on, like, is Chalice in the deck? People don't know whether or not it should be playing Mox Diamond. People aren't sure how many colors it should be in, how many basics it should run. Like, this is a deck that is still in development. Like, it is not ready to be cut down from on high because it's not there yet.
Yeah, I agree. And the Eldrazi deck, once again, we're talking about... So the Eldrazi deck simply does not work without the busted lands. The Eldrazi Temple, Ancient Tomb, City of Traders, those sort of things that get you 2 colorless mana for 1 land drop. Though you don't see Thought Not Seer getting bladed like miracles. Like, the card is just not defensible on rate if you're not cheating it into play or skimping it into play in some capacity. And one thing that is true right now is that stuff like Wasteland and Blood Moon and Back to Basics and Harbinger of the Seas suck against Rescaminator. There is no point in a Rescaminator game where you can afford to Wasteland them. Now you're down a resource against a deck that could kill you with 2 mana. And they could split that 2 mana up over 2 turns. They could kill you with 1 land easily. You can never Wasteland when you're being connected with a Psychic Frog. Like, you will just be buried. There's so many problems. Back to Basics saying Blood Mooning. Like, Blood Moon was briefly well positioned against Rescaminator, and then they printed Psychic Frog. And now Blood Moon's a joke. Like, these cards that are historically proven in Legacy sideboards and would help with the Eldrazi problem are just so embarrassing against the top S tier decks right now that we can't really make room for them, which is another factor of anyone being worried about Eldrazi. Like, I think the deck's good. I personally have not heard calls for banning something out of Eldrazi, but it is very clearly a deck that recently got a big boost and is at the Legacy competitive power level.
I just took a quick look at MTG Goldfish. It is the 2nd most played deck according to Goldfish standards. I don't have the data from challenges in front of me or anything like that, but just going by Goldfish numbers, it seems to be fairly popular. And I'm looking through the deck list. There is not a card to me that stands out as like, oh, this card is the issue. This card should be banned. And I could make a joke here about Chalice of the Void or the sideboard Mindbreak Traps that definitely should not be there. But it is Ancient Tombs and like Ilugan. Like, do we really want to ban either of those cards out of Legacy? I don't think so. I think that this card is likely fine. And if everyone isn't gunning for Dimir or Scaminator, then they could look at Eldrazi and recognize that Blood Moon effects are good, or Consign to Memory is very good against them. There's ways to combat, but right now, with everything else at the top of the format, Eldrazi, I think, is getting away for free at the moment. It reminds me a little bit of right after the initiative ban, how there was other initiative decks that were doing really well, and then those decks cycled out. Phil, you're not going to like this, but I could see Eldrazi cycling out over the next few months.
No, I think that deck is going to lose at least 50% of its meta share within a week of August 26th. I think that is just a very reasonable thing. I think this deck is super beatable. I think people right now just can't be trying to beat it because it's the 2nd most important thing, not the first.
And just another thing that adding to my Delver is a good shell to balance a format around talk from earlier. Eldrazi is ultimately a clunky Ancient Tomb deck. If you've ever played Eldrazi, and Phil, feel free to chime in. If you've ever played Eldrazi or colorless Mystic Forge Stompy or Moon Prison or any of these Ancient Tomb decks, and your opponent goes land Delver, pass on the play, how good do you feel about your Ancient Tomb, Phil?
It's fucking bad, man. It's real bad.
Right. And Delver of Secrets is now accompanied by Nethergoyf, which I've consistently seen at 4 and 5 power. It seems like every time it shows up, it's 4 or 5 power by the time it attacks. It's crazy how quickly that thing grows. And if these tempo decks, these fair tempo decks that exchange resources back and forth, are naturally good at being predators versus the decks like Eldrazi, that creates a fun little back and forth at the top of the format. Like the decks I like to play with those Swords to Plowshares and stuff, and Island Ponder Keep, nice slow game plan, build a stable engine. That stuff gets run over by Eldrazi if I don't have something specific in mind. But I'm great, or, as good as anyone can be against a Delver style deck. Delver running over Eldrazi, we get this nice little ebb and flow rock, paper, scissors, and then decks like Storm Combo or Show and Tell get to exist in the cracks between this fair thing that's happening at the top, and whatever fair deck is best this week, the combo and control decks can adjust to. And that's just another healthy thing where the Delver play pattern naturally is well suited for beating up Ancient Tomb decks.
I think it's very easy to fixate on what the Eldrazi deck is capable of doing, because its best starts are stupid, just like turn 1 Glaring Fleshraker, turn 2 maybe multiple Sowing Mycospawns. There's wild stuff that can happen that is in no capacity beatable for a fair deck. But then there's so many games where you're stuck, you're off a color, you have a Gaia's Cradle but no creature on board. There are a decent number of clunker hands where you're not doing anything inherently unfair.
Right, and then there's the sickos like Bryant, where your opponent on the play is like turn 1 Glaring Fleshraker, and he's like, LED Echo Vions, you're dead. Good game. That's happening too.
Those people deserve it. They registered Eldrazi.
Bryant jokes that they don't need the Mindbreak traps, but they fucking do. Some of those Eldrazi decks aren't playing literally any cards for combo in game 1 outside of Thought-Knot Seer. Just no Chalice, no Vexing Bauble, just out there raw dogging it versus combo, hoping to turn Eldrazi line breakers sideways and make it work.
And to the point of this shell not being solved yet, I have seen builds that are going too fast for Chalice of the Void. I've seen builds that are going too big for Thought-Knot Seer. And not even those things where it's like, oh yeah, of course, Chalice of the Void, Thought-Knot Seer, then we fill out the rest, right? Even those cards are flex slots right now, depending on where you're trying to go with your deck. It's wild. I don't think I've ever seen a shell like this so in flux as the Eldrazi deck is right now.
You can even go bigger with Null Drifters, where it can be this early game draw to, or a very, very castable finisher. There's a huge degree of flexibility here. If I were, on the grind, this would be a very fun problem to solve and put 50 leagues into, but that is not where I am at with my life right now.
Right. So let's segue into the next couple points we're going to make and the closing section of the pod here. Phil, if your Eldrazi deck needs colorless mana for its Eldrazi, it needs red for its Eldrazi Linebreaker, it needs green for Sowing Mycospawn, and then you've got Null Drifter and the Battle Mage that want blue mana, that's a 4-color deck that has to play Ancient Tomb and Eldrazi Temple. There is something exploitable there, and it's in the mana base, and we could hit it with way more than Wasteland.
Yeah, so Blood Moon is something I've seen a lot of recently. I have seen more back to basics in the past 2 weeks than I have in probably the year prior to that. Its lands are very exploitable. Most of these Eldrazi lists squeeze in 2 basics into that greedy mana base, usually 1 forest and 1 wastes. Sometimes you will see a second forest in there if a deck is particularly green heavy and is not doing much with the flex slots. But you can really do a lot if you can attack non-basic lands in some way. And like, God forbid you're a sicko who just wants to register a Price of Progress and just kill the Eldrazi deck in one go.
Yep, for sure. And we talked about it last episode as well, but Painter Servant, all of the Eldrazi cards call out colorless specifically. And if you paint them any color at all of their lands tap for 1, except Ancient Tomb, the one that actually says tap for 2 on it. But Eldrazi Temple doesn't work. Eye of Ugin is a stone blank at that point. A bunch of that stuff just no longer functions with a Painter Servant in play. And Painter Servant is also a deck that historically has main or side decked Blood Moon in some capacity, either Blood Moon or Magus of the Moon. Extremely well positioned if this metagame shakes out in a Eldrazi forward way after August 26th. And I think that's going to be a big part of Phil's prediction that Eldrazi is going to cut in half very quickly.
So the other thing is that it's very easy to just play a deck that beats Eldrazi by ignoring Wasteland. One of the most powerful things in the current Eldrazi decks is Sowing Mycospawn. The ability to, maybe on turn 2 or turn 3, play a 3/3 that just always wastelands your opponent is insane. And when your opponent instead leads on Island Ponder, Plains Stoneforge, another Plains, Source to Plowshare is your thing, put in Kaldra, go, or any equivalent play pattern, like your Sowing Mycospawn has no room to do the thing that it is best at doing, and Sowing Mycospawn just turns into another thing that produces mana when you're already at 4 mana.
Right, and once you start kicking Mycospawn versus the basic decks, they can run out of colored sources, but 6 is a lot more than 4, even when you're cheating on all the mana counts in the deck.
So I expect that in the wake of these bannings, we are going to see more and more decks that can take advantage of basic lands. And if you are a basic land deck with very efficient removal, probably white removal, you are likely to be very well positioned versus Eldrazi. If for some reason Prismatic Ending is not particularly well positioned, you can go back to other exile cards, your Path to Exiles or whatever, and you can probably just bury Eldrazi in Swords, Snapcaster Swords, or whatever you want to be doing.
Terminus, the resurgence of Terminus. We haven't seen that one in a while.
I do think Up the Beanstalk decks are primed to make a comeback post-ban.
Yep, Leyline Binding gets all this stuff. But if we're talking about that, this pod is wrapping up, but that's another spin-off conversation, because how safe is 5-color Leyline Binding Beanstalk if people are packing Blood Moons and Harbinger of the Seas and Wastelands and Price of Progresses to fight Eldrazi? That's another problem for those decks. And then we start talking about, maybe we go back to Bug Beanstalk, which isn't so greedy with its mana and doesn't get punished quite so hard, and it is its own Wasteland deck. And now we're back in a relatively fun and healthy metagame like we had back at Eternal Weekend at the end of last year.
As we wrap this up, I think we just need to drive the point home. Wizards, please ban Grief and Psychic Frog. Don't make the mistake like you did the last BNR. Just take care of the problems. They both need to go. Please don't take Grief. You need to take the Frog too.
Yes.
I am really worried that we only get a Grief ban and then we end up in this low energy, stagnant format prior to Eternal Weekend, where people are just not excited and hyped up about the format leading up to our premier event of the year. And then a couple weeks before the event, we get the Psychic Frog ban after the Duskmourn release. And then it's okay, cool. Now we have a couple of weeks to test for Eternal Weekend instead of the months that some people would really like to be, getting their hands on the format. The people who have jobs and kids and stuff, they are not going to be well equipped for Eternal Weekend if they can't spread their testing out over time.
Yeah, and we touched on this in the pre-show quite a bit. If you want to hear the rest of this conversation, join our Patreon. But in the pre-show, we mentioned every format has something that's a little sick at the top and then a bunch of things that are a little sick just under it. I would not be upset if across all formats we saw a ban of over 10 cards on August 26th. If they hit Amalia and Vein Ripper and Treasure Cruise out of Pioneer, and then Grief and Psychic Frog out of Legacy, and then Nadu and something out of Necrodominance, maybe Soul Spike.
Grief.
Grief can leave Modern as well. That's busted there. Should have gone when Fury went, honestly. So that's 3 or 4, something out of the Energy Shell. That's 3 or 4 cards that could leave Modern, because I don't think banning Nadu out of Modern solves that format either. There's a bunch of messed up stuff waiting right under it. I haven't played Pauper in a minute. I actually like Vintage a lot right now. So Vintage seems like the safe place right now, or Standard. I have enjoyed my time playing Standard when I had to do that for the RC. So, but in terms of all the middle of the road, non-rotating formats, I would like to see a big shakeup. Shift that metagame.
Yeah, shift the metagame, restore the players' faith in competitive constructed play, and get us excited again.